verses 35 through 58. No problem, right? Actually, I'd love to spend way more time on this just because there's so much really good stuff in it. But we're going to finish up on the resurrection, 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And we've looked at the basis of the resurrection in the first part of this in verses 1 through 11. And then 12 through 34, last time, we looked at the certainty of the resurrection and Paul's arguments for that and the ramifications of the resurrection and if there was no resurrection and all the different things that come along with it. And one of the things that we saw there was, of course, if what they were preaching was incorrect, they're making God a liar, right? And their life is going to be different because Paul basically says, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. Because if there's nothing after this, who cares, right? And you hear people say that, and that's because they don't think there is anything after this, or if they do, they get, well, God's going to let me in. Who cares?
My good always my bad.
Yeah, I'm not Hitler, right? Isn't that the famous line? I saw some comedian doing about the things that go wrong, and then the defense is always, well, if you can put a man on the moon, how come you can't do X? You know, so in religion it's always, well, I'm not as bad as Hitler, or pick your favorite dictator or people you don't like. So I'm better than him, so I'm good.
Full pot.
Yeah, any of these people. But what Paul is going to argue, though, today, and we're going to look at, he pretty much defended last time. He said, look, there is a resurrection. There's a certainty of a resurrection. There's a ramification of a resurrection. But now he's actually going to address a question that people might ask. And he's going to address, how is the resurrection possible? What kind of resurrection is it? What does it look like? And what does that ultimately mean? And so that's why this lesson is titled, The Resurrection, the Body, and Triumph. Because that's what we're going to see at the end of the lesson, is there is triumph, there is validity to everything that's being done. Again, that is an argument within the context, which can be extended, but in the context, that's what Paul's saying. If you remember, if there was no resurrection, there is a lot of really not good things that come along with that. So this lesson is broken up into 4 parts. How is the resurrection possible, and some other things that go along with that. Talking about the earthly and the heavenly, because that's going to be one of his main argument themes. A mystery, and this, excuse me, this is something that Paul is going to deal with in a way that says, well, it's a mystery, but there's some significant understanding that comes along with the mystery that he reveals. And then triumphal labor. In other words, everything that you're doing, saying, speaking, is not in vain because of the resurrection. If it wasn't for that, it would be. And so there is something that's triumphal in it, beyond just, oh, that's a cool event in the past. No, it's about the future too. So that's how we're going to break this down. So, how's the resurrection possible? And this is verses 35 through 41, and we're going to look at that. And he says, but someone will ask, how are the dead raised, and with what kind of body do they come? Now, Paul is very gentle in his response. You foolish person. Right. That's usually how you start a conversation. Here, let me ask you a question. Look, you foolish person. No, there's a reason why he does this. What you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And what you sow is not the body that is to be, but a bare kernel, perhaps of wheat or some other grain. But God gives it a body as he has chosen, and each kind of seed has its own body. For not all flesh is the same, but there's one kind for humans, others for animals, for birds, another for fish. There are heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, but the glory of the heavenly one is one kind, and the glory of the earthly is another kind. There is one glory of the sun, another glory of the moon, another glory of the stars, for stars differ from star in glory. Okay, star differ from star in glory. Well, he begins this, and you're sitting, why is he talking about birds and animals and flesh and glory and planets and stars? Well, there's a reason. But his argument, if you know, Paul always is going to set up a premise. He is asking a question, but these questions are, they're not rhetorical, but they're indirect. Remember, he's been trying to help the Corinthians understand that they really don't understand the resurrection properly. And here he says, all right, you agree there is a resurrection, and of course you're going to be argumentative about it, and you're going to ask, how are the dead raised, and what kind of body do they come with, or what is that going to look like? And in a sense, that's a valid question, right? Anybody ever asked you that? What's it going to look like? What are we going to be like in heaven? Kind of a thing. It's a fascinating question. In this context, though, he's not trying just to deal with a fascinating question. He is going to be instructive in what's going on. But by the next statement, you foolish person, isn't like he's going, that was a really great question, right? So in this context, he's not trying to say that's a great question. It's trying to say you really don't get it. The question of how are the dead raised and with what kind of body are they raised are something that he is going to answer, though. He's going to show them. Now, when he says, you foolish person, why might he say that? Or how can he say that? And why does he open up with, but someone will ask? Why does he say that? Again, now I'm trying to, why would he do this, and how could we apply just these opening phrases? What kind of argument is he putting forth?
Somebody will ask, well, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't work.
Okay, they could be asking if that doesn't work, so they could be argumentative in it. But if you notice what he's written, he says, you guys are saying. Remember, before he said, some of you are saying, how can some of you say there is no resurrection, right? And he's dealt with there is one. But now he shifts the language and he says, for someone will ask. How is this possible? When you're dealing with somebody, how well do they like to be attacked? Isn't it much easier for us to stand by and go, yeah, it's them. Okay, Paul, go for it. I'm going to stand back over here and, go for it, Paul. That's what he's basically doing for the Corinthians. It allows them who may have been convinced, okay, well, maybe there is a resurrection, Paul. Even though they're probably asking those same questions, and people do ask these questions, right? Aren't these questions any of us might ask? But so he's trying to instruct them by not going directly at them, but being able to be direct, right? It's them over there, and let me tell you about them. So it's not you. If it's not you, what are you willing to do? Listen. Okay, especially when he says, you foolish person. All right, Bob, you foolish person. I mean, that's not going to work out too well in a conversation. So even here, he's taking a slightly indirect approach and says, somebody might ask this question. It's a wonderful teaching technique. Now, some of you might be thinking this, or there's some who have asked me that question. Let's talk about it. So it's a really powerful technique. So again, it's not so much, okay, why is he saying this? But how can we apply that kind of thing in our life? When you're talking with family, with friends, it's like tell the story. Why are fables so wonderfully powerful? You're talking about a silly rabbit and a fox and a raven and all this other kind of stuff. And then people listen and they are hearing the story, and you're hoping they're hearing it applies to you, but you're not going directly at them. So this is what Paul is doing when he sets up this argument. That way he can be far more direct in his statements, far more logical in his arguments, far more forceful in them without insulting these people.
Pride won't get in the way of learning.
Pride won't get in the way of learning. You've deflected the emotional content. Now they can think and hear and listen. It's very powerful for kids, for anybody. If your children are being irrational, how can you reason with them? And the answer is just yell louder, right? Usually doesn't work, does it? So here he's not going to yell louder at the Corinthians. He's really going to come down and say, let me help you understand what's going on by somebody might ask this question. And then I'm going to address this person who asked this question as, you foolish person. Now, why would he do that? I've just read parts of it. But why would he do that? And then how biblically might there be a response to this? What do you think? Why might he want to say, you foolish person?
Because they don't want to identify with that foolish person
Okay, well, and yeah, they don't want to identify with that foolish person. But if he's going to deal with this, he can say this of this foolish person because he's going to use, and he does use, a obvious argument to them of this day. What sows does not, what you sow does not come to life unless it dies. So if you notice, he's saying, you guys just look around. Even if you didn't get this, look around. What happens? And again, they lived in an agrarian society. They're not this, what is this thing called a seed, that we look at, right?
Stubborn ignorance.
Well, they were stubborn, of course. But what he's trying to say to them is, something that's obvious in your life and society, you should already recognize. How could this be? He's saying there's an example I can give you as an analogy, because that's what he's going to do. And it's right here. Let me take this seed, and what happens to this seed, folks, when you plant it? It dies. And what happens? And something grows up. Is it a seed? No. It's what comes from the seed. See? The problem we have is our modern understanding of plant biology. Well, this is here and it's replicating, and we don't see it as dying. They did. Because the seed is no longer there, is it? It's gone. It's dead. Buried. And yet, look what comes up. So he can say, there's an obvious example, you foolish people. You just look in front of you. And again, I forgive all people who are non-gardeners and don't know what a plant is and what end of the, seeds you plant in the ground, which you don't. Tubers and bulbs, it makes a difference. Seeds, it doesn't. But they would not. They would get this. We just have a problem with it with our modern society. But let me ask you another question, because this is going to be ultimately Paul's going to ultimately deal with. When the Bible speaks of a foolish person, what is one of the major things that a foolish person does, or is, or forgets? There's your hint. Forgets.
Recognize the power of God.
Recognize the power of God. Yeah. What is a wise person? Remember the sermon I did a while back? The wise person is going to look, think, and act as looking at it from God's perspective. That's what wisdom, true wisdom is. And what have the Corinthians been talking about? Look how wise we are. And why does he keep calling them foolish and unwise? Because they are looking at it from what? Man's perspective. So when he says, you foolish person, he's saying, you've totally forgotten about God. How can there be a resurrection? How does he do this? It's like, you foolish person, do you not understand who God is? Right? Now, if you start thinking about man, well, I don't know. How would that work? Right? How would that all pan out? And the answer is, I don't know about you, but it doesn't seem to work too well. And then he would say, you foolish person, who's your God? Who is God? What did he do? I don't know. Created a few things, So he's going to say, that's why he's saying you foolish persons, because you've completely forgotten on an earthly perspective. I can give you an analogy, and I'm going to do that. Matter of fact, I'm going to show you right here in these next phrases what I'm talking about. You can just look around you and see that. But more so, you have forgotten about God. When you ask that question, you fundamentally are forgetting about who he is. That's why he says, you foolish person. He's not just saying you're some kind of dummy, even though he's going to make a point here of like, let me explain to you, even in things you don't even have to know about God to see what I'm talking about. So he starts off and he says, all right, what's it going to look like? He says, you foolish person, don't you know that what you sow doesn't come to life unless it dies? And what you sow is not the body that is to be, but a bare kernel, perhaps of wheat or grain. So he's saying, here's my analogy. There's your grain, you put it in, it dies, but that's not what comes up. A plant comes up. And oh, by the way, yes, there's seeds or grains or other things that what you planted, but what comes up is not just grain. You don't just put it in the ground and there's this pile of grain that is done, the next morning, right? So that's not what happens. It's not some kind of replication process from the seed perspective. So you can see that. But what does God do? God gives the body as he has chosen. If you notice here, who's in charge of what that looks like? God is, right? And if you're a gardener, does it not irritate you when you plant snap peas and you get snow peas? We do that every year. These are snap peas. How come I'm getting snow peas and snap peas? Somebody's not doing a very good job packaging. Now, if you planted corn and you get tomatoes, doesn't work, right? Well, God says, a corn seed replicates corn. A tomato seed replicates tomatoes, because that's how I've ordained it to be. Every time. You don't just throw it in the ground and go, hey, corn this year, tomatoes next year. So he says, what goes in the ground and what comes out of the ground is still going to be the same kind, but it's not going to be the same body. Right? And therefore he continues on. For, why? Not all flesh is the same. There's one kind for humans and animals and birds and fish. There are heavenly bodies. And there are earthly bodies. If you notice, he's going to talk about heavenly and earthly right here. What do you think that's going to be a setup for? You guys have been following Paul's logic. Why is he going to say there are heavenly bodies and earthly bodies? And we're talking about the resurrection from the dead, and how can that be? And what do you think he's doing? Yeah, setting it up for the resurrection of our bodies. There's a earthly and there is a heavenly, right? He's going to set that whole argument up. And if you notice, he started with, don't you understand when something dies, it comes back? There's different kinds of bodies, and there's different types of bodies, and there are earthly bodies and heavenly bodies. And of course, from the heavenly body perspective, he's talking sun and moon and stars, right? Because that's how they viewed the world. Remember, this is not a science lesson, folks. This is how they viewed the world, right? Those are heavenly bodies, and they're very different than an earthly body. And so he says there's different kinds of bodies. There's different kinds of flesh. There's different kinds of things, and God is the one at will who has ordained it to be that way. Then he continues on and he says, but the glory of the heavenly one is of one kind, and the glory of the earthly is another kind. So he's not only saying, not only is the body different, the glory is different. For there is one glory of the sun, and another glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars. For star differs from star in glory. So he's saying even within the domain of stars, because there's the plural, there's one moon, one sun. Within the stars, don't they have a different glory the way they look at it? Remember, they're not worrying about, yes, the sun's a star and the stars are suns and all that kind of stuff. They're looking at them from the sky. If you look up in the sky, do they not have different glories? Right. So what he's basically saying is, look at it, different bodies, different glories, different natures, different kinds. Things that are planted, things that are sown are different when they come back. That's what you get. So what do you think this is now going to set up as an analogy for the resurrection? How many people have ever asked you, well, how in the world for bodies that get buried in the ocean and the fish eat them, how's that body going to come back, right? And you, of course, now know in science that the body you had 1 year ago of the material substance that's in it is not the same material substance you have today. Did you know that? You have been completely replaced in the last year. And yet you're still you.
Yeah, but the pots are all older.
Yeah, some of the stuff's a little older and a little mustier. It's reformed in a different way, yeah. There's this hair stuff missing, the color, all that stuff has changed. But basically, do you really think that, and I'm just going to give you just here speculate, do you think that Paul's really talking about, I'm really going to give you an answer of how all these molecules get reassembled from a physical body? Do you think that's really going to be his argument? No. But isn't that what we think? Well, how's that going to happen? So what do you bet the body he's talking about isn't worrying so much about what gets buried in the grave? Because that's not resurrected. That's not what he's talking about. Yes, there is a resurrection body, but we're going to see what kind of body does God give just as he wills. What kind of glory is it going to have? It's going to have a glory. Where is it? What kind of body is it? An earthly one or a heavenly one? Heavenly one. See? You guys already got it, so I can stop teaching. But let's see what Paul has to say, because he's better at it than I do. All right. So there's what he sets up. Now, look at verses 42 through 49. And this is how we break it down, the earthly and the heavenly. Watch what he now does. He's told you about the different kinds of bodies and the different glories of the bodies, and God gives them, and what is sown is not the same. It says, so it is with the resurrection, okay? Here's what I just described, so it is with the resurrection. Now I'm going to tell you about what that so it looks like with the resurrection. What is sown is perishable. What is raised is imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. Thus it is written, for the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. But it is not the spiritual that comes first, but the natural, then the spiritual. The first man was of the earth, a man of dust. The second man is from heaven. As a man of dust, so also are you who are of the dust, as is the man of heaven. So also those who are of heaven. Just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the man of heaven. If you notice, he just keeps comparing. Earth, 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 heaven, 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 heaven. Now, here's where some of the cool things that come into both the language and the culture, which I just found absolutely fascinating, so I hope you do. If you're bored, just raise your hand and I'll stop talking. But I found this quite fascinating. He's now linking these bodies to the resurrection of the dead. And he starts off, he says, what is sown is perishable, what is raised is imperishable. All right? What is fascinating is the word that we think sown, we always think of burial, if you're thinking dead. We think seed, which we're thinking agriculture. But there's a third way that word is used in this culture, or these cultures of this time. Sowing something also was associated with the creation and origins of something. Okay? All right? And that included mankind. All right? I'm pressing you. But when he says it is sown, what is sown is perishable, and what is raised is imperishable, he's not just talking about the physical here. Because what is he going to end up doing? He's going to create two classes. Those of Adam, earthly, those of dust, and then he's going to create the other class, those of heaven, those of Christ. Those are perishable, those are imperishable. And he's basically setting up two classes and saying the origin of these two classes, what is sown is what? What is the man of dust? Perishable, corruptible, mortal, etc. So where do we come from? We're of the same class, right? We are in Adam, so to speak, because we are also in Christ. If you notice how he's setting these parallels up. Your origin is sown. Where did you come from? Our origin is of the man of dust. That nature there. And this other word here, and it says, so what is it? It's dishonored, but it's going to be glorious. It's weak, but it's going to be raised to power. It was perishable, it's going to be imperishable. It is sown a natural body and raised a spiritual body. Now, what's interesting about that word for natural, which is a pretty good rendering to make it a little more neutral, the word itself could be literally translated soulful. A soulful body. So, in other words, he's not trying to say, what's the material? He's saying, what is the nature of it? It's a soulful one, right? Man became a living being. Soulful. And he said, basically here, what you have here is yes, it's perishable, yes, it's corruptible, yes, it's weak, yes, it doesn't have the power, but it's a soulful body. And we all follow from that. That's why the translators use the word natural, okay, versus heavenly. So it's an easier comparison, but it can be translated very easily. A soulful one. Well, you have a soulful body that has raised a spiritual body. Think about that. When we say the soul lives on, well, yes, there's the seed, but what comes up? Spiritual body. Does that make sense? See, isn't it beautiful? When he's now taking, yes, there's this physical analogy I'm giving you, but I'm really giving you a spiritual analogy. What are we? We are corruptible, soulful beings. What are we going to be raised? Incorruptible, spiritual beings. So he's already setting the different types and classes apart, and he's going to continue that. Am I pressing too hard on this? Does this make sense? It's fascinating to me. But it's amazing because we just think, oh, he's just talking about burying stuff. Look, we had the seed, it was buried, now suddenly there's this burial, and then you go, but what's being raised? Is it the physical that's being raised? Is that really what he's arguing? The answer is I don't think so. And we're going to see why. He continues on, and he says, thus it is written, the first man became a living being, right? The last Adam, and this is last as in ultimate or preeminent. It could be sequential, but there's two. Became a life-giving spirit. So what is he saying about Christ in that? Is he the same as Adam? But Adam was a living being, right? But Christ is the life-giving spirit. So again, he's now setting apart these two things. But was not Christ fully human? Certainly. He's fully divine. And so we're now dealing with natural and heavenly, soulful and spiritual. Again, two sets of origins, right? Your origin is in Christ, or your origin is in Adam. And the Adam origin, problem. The Christ origin, nailed it. Does that make sense? That's why he's using the word sown, because it acts as almost, if you will, a double entendre, double meaning in the way the word's used. Question?
Yeah, I just kind of like when Christ was raised, he didn't leave the body in the grave. The body was transformed. So I'm assuming Paul's still going to
Paul's going to talk about the transformation.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly. See, we have somebody who's asking the question that Paul's going to answer. Yeah, exactly. That's what he's going to do. He's going to answer the question. But see, we get so hung up on, look, there's this physical body and it's physically raised, and then people go, well, if it's about a physical body being physically raised, then what about the people in space and eat by the fishes and whatever else? And that's not really the point. But there is a body, yes. But is it of the same kind? No. Because one's immortal and the other one's mortal, one's perishable. So he continues on here, and he goes on and he says, all right, but it's not the spiritual that is first, but the natural, then the spiritual. Was there not an order of the resurrection that Paul argued earlier in chapter 15? What was the order of the resurrection? Christ, the first fruits, and then all who are alive or who are raised at his appearing. When the king returns, we're going to see he's going to argue some more of that here. That's when things are going to happen. So Christ is the first. We're afterwards. And so in the body, there's the natural, Adam, followed by Christ. See how he's saying there's an order to things. It's God is orderly. Otherwise, all of history would have happened instantaneously, and there would be no history because time has to exist for history to exist, right? And yet we realize that God has known all things from the beginning, before, and after, and eternity, and everything else, because time is meaningless to him. We are time-bound beings. He is not. So he has to explain things in time progression. Okay, and he says the first man was from what? The earth. And how is the earth being described here? A man of dust. The second man is from heaven. As was the man of dust, so we are also of dust. As is the man of heaven, so we also are of heaven. In Adam, in Christ. Of dust, of heaven. Now, something else I'm going to point this out. It's not in the notes per se. The Corinthians and people of their day and time would look at the world and say nothing of this corrupt and perishable world could exist in, if you will, in their view, not the Corinthians Christians, but other people of the day, could exist amongst the gods or in the heavens. You couldn't. So that would be one of their questions. Well, how could your body exist with the gods? Even in their culture, they would ask that question. And the answer is, if you're going to be raised and be with God, how's that possible? They would ask that question. So if you get the question today, well, how can the body isn't just assembled and all that stuff? Well, they would have been asked the exact same question, except they'd be a lot more theologically on the line with what Paul's trying to describe here. Because they would have held the same view. The earthly cannot, the corruptible cannot, the flawed cannot be in heaven with deity. Doesn't work. And all of these people would have believed that. So you can see why Paul is continuing down this argument and why he's saying, yes, you're right. The earthly can't be with the heavenly. Therefore, what is required? The earthly becomes what? Spiritual, heavenly. It has to change. Which is what he's going to bring up. What is the resurrection from the dead about? Bringing up a body? No. It's about the transformation of the earthly to be fit for heavenly. See the difference? And yes, there is a body. But that's not the point. The point is you now can be fit for heaven. Because of who?
Christ.
Because of Christ, yeah. See, Jesus is the answer to that question. So, see, isn't it beautiful? So sometimes the Sunday school answer actually works, right? Okay, let's continue on. But you see why he's arguing down this path and why these people might ask these questions? And they're valid questions. But they're invalid questions if you forget God. And what have these people been forgetting about who might say there is no resurrection? I'm sorry, there's no regenerative technique that can bring the body back together once it's been dissolved. You missed the point, folks. What about God? Now, if you don't believe in God, it doesn't matter, right? It's an irrelevant question. Why were you worrying about resurrection from the dead? If it wasn't for God, it wouldn't happen. Couldn't happen. It's not possible to happen. So he continues on in verse 49. He says, just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the man of heaven. Have you ever thought about that? Man was made in God's image, and yet it was still an image of something that could be corrupted, that was weak. Here, he says, we're going to bear the image of Christ, the heavenly. And what is that? Perfect, imperishable, incorruptible, glorious, powerful. Again, one image, the other image. So continuously through this entire process, he is giving us a set of parallels. Now, he has not gone back and said, this is how you bury somebody so that they can be raised. Right? Has nothing to do with that. All right. Now, here's John's question being answered by Paul. Verse 50 through 54. He says, I tell you this, brothers. Flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. So he says, I agree with you guys. I agree with the culture. I agree with everybody on these statements because you're right. It can't be. This is a true statement. Now I'm going to answer your question, how can it be? I think there's a song like that. No. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. Now, that may sound like just a simple statement. And what kind of mystery is that, Paul? Well, first off, what do you think when you're talking about the resurrection of the dead, everybody would presume? They got to die to be resurrected. And he says, I'm going to tell you something that you haven't thought about and it has not been revealed. You don't have to die to be resurrected. So he's automatically going, it isn't about being buried, folks. The sowing isn't about your burial graves and things like that. Because some of you, when the Lord returns, whoever they may be, will be changed, because all will be changed. It doesn't matter whether you're dead or alive. So it's not about your body. It's about who you are, your soulishness, and in whom you are in. Adam, or Christ. That's going to be the difference. Otherwise, you'd say, okay, we got to kill everybody first. All right, God comes back. I'm killing you all. Okay, now I can raise you. Until then, I couldn't do it. Really? But, I mean, sometimes we think that way, right? I mean, isn't that the way we think? And that's why he's saying this is a mystery. You may not have thought about this, but let me explain to you, because you're so locked in on the burial and dying and all, because the resurrection of the dead, I mean, that's what we think. But it's the resurrection of those who have died in what? What is it really being resurrected from? What's that?
Their sinful nature.
Yeah, your sin. You have been killed. And when God says, in this day you shall surely die, did Adam and Eve fall over dead? But did they die? Yeah, because now they're all in Adam. And Paul goes on in Romans 5 and talks about that even though they didn't sin in the same way, sin came to all men, right? I'm not going to go any farther. But if you notice here, because I know all the questions that can open up, so forgive me, we're stopping. But if you notice here, he's saying, look, all of those who have died and are dead, remember we talked about some of this stuff with the baptism of the dead and things like that? He's really looking at this and saying, you're in Adam, you're part of Adam's children, you're in part of all of that stuff, you're a part of the natural, you're part of that soulfulness, you're part of the first, and you're dead. And those who are alive, who are still dead, will be raised, will be changed because of who they are in. They are in Christ. That is the powerful thing that he says is a mystery. That's the thing that if you don't get, you've missed what I've been talking about. And that is the new mystery that he says. All will be changed. And there's the reason why. Without the transformation, zippo. It has no meaning whatsoever. And does God need you to die to change you? No. So when Christ comes back, all those who are alive will be changed, just like all those who are dead will be changed. Because it's about being in Christ, not being dead or alive physically. Question?
So in Hebrews 9:27, it is appointed unto man once to die, but after this the judgment. Do you think the key is the word appointed rather than the phrase once to die?
The once to die, whether we do. Well, let's just say that dealing with that particular Hebrews passage about appointment to once to die and what Paul says here, we aren't going to all die.
Yeah, the appointment can be changed.
Can be changed. Yeah. And guess what? If you think of it physically, then you go, well, these people didn't die. If you think of it spiritually, have they all died? Yep, so they're all dead. We're all dead. Unless you're in Christ. And then you're not. But you will be changed. Again, see, a little tricky stuff here. But if you see how he's making his arguments, he's making arguments. And sometimes we get locked in on the physical nature of an argument versus the concept and the analogy of an argument. So if you locked in on the seed must be planted physically type of a thing, then how are you going to see sowing? Well, you're going to see it as dying. And you're going to see it as burial. The point was not that. The point was, if you plant something, it's going to die, and something else is going to come up. It's going to look different. And what is he saying here? When something's dead and is now made alive in Christ, something different is going to come up. So it's an analogy of the parallelism, not the physical nature analogy of it. It's the spiritual analogy that he's using here. So he continues on and he says, you shall not sleep, but we should all be changed. And now he says, how is this change going to happen? Because that's the natural question that's going to be the follow-on. Well, how long is that going to take? Do you have to stay in the ground, or do you have to live this long? Or what's going to happen? Are we just going to sort of start glowing and then, what's going to happen? And he says, what's going to happen? It's going to be in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. Now, lots of people go way overboard and wild on this one too. So again, as I have been doing through this whole book, we're staying in its context and what Paul is trying to say. Not how you might try to make it say what you want it to say, regardless of what view you hold in these various areas. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, good. If you do know what I'm talking about, you're going to be mad at me no matter what view you hold. in a moment. This is basically the word where we get our word in English for atom, which basically is the most, in the Greek, it would be considered indivisible. And since we're talking about time in a twinkling of an eye, or some translations in a blink of an eye, we're talking about a transformation of a change which is indivisibly instantaneous. If I was talking physics, it would be Planck time.
So it's kind of like
10 to the minus 43rd seconds. Yes?
it's kind of like the when you're saved, you're transformed instantaneously.
Yeah, when you're saved, you're transferred instantaneously. Yeah, it's in like that. So in other words, he's given us the smallest divisible statement of the Greek language with an image that you can go a twinkling, a blink of an eye, like that. So he's giving you something that is incomprehensible, theoretic, and something that you see every day. And he says, but it's going to be like that. And then he adds, at the last trumpet. All right. Now, you do guys realize that Revelation hadn't been written yet? Just so you know. This could be sequential, okay, which some people argue. But the reality, my opinion, based on the background and the context of this, is what he's really talking about here is at the arrival of the king. Because in the last trumpet, and those ideas in the Old Testament, I've got some stuff in your notes here, it's really almost, not always, but almost always associated with the presence of God. So when Christ appears, when the King comes, we will all be changed in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, instantaneously at the last trumpet. Because that's the imagery that's being here. Now, can that be applied elsewhere? Possibly. Could it be used elsewhere? Possibly. But what do you think Paul's really trying to get at here? If I'm saying at the indivisible smallest unit, in a twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, and he's already been talking about at Christ's return, and that's the presence of God, and that's the return of the King, it seems to make sense that, and since it's used that way in the Old Testament, it's most likely being used that way here. Right? We're not trying to fix trumpets and bowls and, things like that. I don't think that's what Paul's trying to get at here. Maybe you can use it that way, but I don't think that's its intent here. Does that make all sense? So that's why he's trying to say, we will be changed. It's going to be like boom. And when's it going to happen? When Christ returns. And you don't have to die to be changed. That's the mystery. All right. Now, what's going to happen at that? For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be what? Raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. For this perishable body must put on imperishable. This mortal body must put on immortality. Now, is he talking about, okay, you guys have to go and change your clothes? The stinky corpse needs to put on the clothes? He's saying this soulishness, this natural, this in Adam body, which has now been changed, will put on immortality. Will put on, because we will be like what? The heavenly one. And yet Christ said, here, touch me. Spirits don't eat. Right? So there is something about that body that's real. But he doesn't describe what that is, because what's going to happen? We don't know what that's really going to look like. But we do know that God is going to be the giver of it. He's going to be the changer of it. He's going to be the empowering whatever. Boy, that's really bad language. He's going to empower it all, right? When the perishable puts on imperishable, the immortal puts on immortal, then shall come to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? So he's basically making a statement here that says, at the resurrection, the power of death is broken. You go, wasn't the power of death broken at the resurrection of Christ? And the answer is yes, but what has Paul argued? First fruits and Christ's return. He's basically said, yes, the power of death was broken because Christ was raised. And yet, ultimately, here's the question for all you questioning people. Well, yeah, that was Christ. What about all these other dummies that are in Adam, these dusty people? Don't know how to dust themselves off. How's that going to happen? Let me see that. Let me see power of death is really broken because one righteous man could pay for one righteous man's sins, which they weren't. Therefore, he could be raised. Right? What about all the rest of them? Did he really pay for their sins? How are you going to know that? When death's power is broken and the dead are raised. That's why there's a gap. That's why this is important. Because Christ was the first fruits, and you can make all sorts of arguments. Well, yeah, sure, Christ, he's perfect. What about them? Did he really pay for anything? See the power and the implication of did Christ die, and was it really an atonement? Again, simple things. Look at the massive theology that comes out of that understanding. And that's a question that they could ask. And Paul says, no, death is swallowed up in victory. Oh, death, where is your victory? Oh, death, where is your sting? And if you're looking for all the quoting of that, it's quoting and paraphrasing and repurposing and repackaging, just so you know. So if you're trying to get, I need to see the exact representation. It's a place in Micah and some other places that he repurposes here. But he's basically saying death is rendered ineffective. And it says, where's your victory? Where's your sting? And he now says, let me show you why death's victory and sting is not there anymore. The sting of death is sin. The power of sin is the law. And who has fulfilled all righteousness? Christ. Therefore, he was the perfect sacrifice. His quote-unquote law-keeping is not that you're getting his righteousness. His law-keeping is the demonstration of his righteousness. Who he is the righteous one. He is the perfect one. And therefore, he kept it perfectly. So the power of the law has no power. And Paul, of course, in Romans and other places said, well, what about people who didn't have the law? Well, they're a law unto themselves, right? Their conscience is going to defend them. When I'm talking with people and I say, can you follow your own rules? The answer is, no, I can't. All right, you've sinned. You can't even follow your own rules, much less God's. You can't reflect him. You can't even reflect yourself. You can't even say, this is who I am, and then be consistent with that, much less being consistent with who God is. And he says, so therefore, the sting of death is sin. So sin's got you. And the power of sin is the law, because God says it's clear. So what did Christ do? He dealt with that. Therefore, when the dead are raised, the perishable will put on imperishable, the mortal will put on immortal, and therefore death has truly, finally been defeated, the last enemy, as Paul has mentioned earlier in the chapter. Question?
Is this the rapture?
Well, see, now, when you start talking rapture and all that kind of stuff, you're now talking eschatological issues that I don't want to get into. Because people can argue these passages left and right. I'm just trying to keep these in. It is his return. And whether you call it a return rapture, return second coming, end of all things. And again, this is where your eschatology comes into play. If you're an amill, this is it. If you're a premill, this is a rapture. Right? It doesn't say. He's not trying to make that point. He's trying to say when Christ returns, whenever that is, for whatever event that is, it's done. Now, this is where people get off in the eschatology. I want to keep it into what is Paul trying to teach him about the resurrection. And I'm not going to fight about timing or not timing or did or didn't happen. Because I don't think that was his point. Might be implied from other passages and things like that. Does that make sense? If you notice, I've been trying to keep this in the context of what the Corinthians were hearing, not in the larger areas of systematic theology. At this point, he's just trying to say, look, when Christ returns, you're going to be changed. And you're all going to be changed. And it's all going to happen. And the immortal is going to be immortal. And the imperishable is going to be imperishable because death will have been broken. The resurrection proves it. Death is done. It has no more power. Now, does that mean that there isn't other things that happen? Let's leave that for another class. But the last thing that he does say, though, is after all that, he says, thanks be to God. Up, you foolish person. But thanks be to God. Right? He's bringing him back. You were a foolish person because you didn't think God could do it. Yeah, he can. You don't even have to die. Who gives what? Victory through Jesus Christ. And therefore he's pointing back to say, sin, the sting of sin, of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. Thanks be to God. He gives us a victory over all that through Jesus Christ. Only in him. Therefore, my beloved brothers, now if you notice here, he's not talking about the theoretic, some might say, some foolish person. He comes back and he says, all right, brothers, all right, sisters, let's look at this real quickly. And there's major implications and application for here. Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. So he's not going, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. He's saying, be steadfast. Remember, he started off with in the beginning of chapter 15 about the belief of what you've believed and you stand in and you're holding to. And unless you've believed in vain, he's coming back to verses 1 and 2, and he's trying to say, remember I told you this is where we stand, this is where it is, this is what's so foundational. Everything you're doing is not in vain. It's triumphal. It has purpose. It has meaning. So be steadfast, immovable. What? Always abounding in the work of the Lord. So he's not just talking about Paul and Apollos and teachers and things like that, where he's been emphasizing earlier in other sections. Here he's talking about believers. Because of the resurrection, everything you do matters. So stand in it, believe it, walk in it, be immovable, always abounding. Not just every once in a while I do something. Abounding in the works of who? The Lord. And that means every day and everything you do and everywhere you live, because of Romans 12:1, right? Because what is your spiritual sacrifice? Your worship? How you live. Are you reflecting that I believe this, that I hold to this, that he is, as Ken was talking about, sanctifying the Lord in your heart? Is he your Lord or not? By the way, holy means set apart. So have you set him apart as Lord? That's the emphasis. Not have you set him apart as holy, because setting somebody apart as holy means they're set apart as set apart. What are you setting him apart as? Lord. Who is he? Christ, Savior, Redeemer, etc. Have you thought of it that way? And if you don't live your life that way, what does this really mean? He says, that's why you need to understand all this stuff. The power of God has broken death. Not only physical, but spiritual. And the spiritual one is the one that was spoken of in the very beginning. You shall surely die. You are dead in Adam. So he comes back and he says that, knowing that your labor in your Lord is not in vain. No vanity in that. Just wonderful, powerful beauty. And that's how we need to think. So again, as I've been saying through this whole class, look at the simple things that are not simplistic. Look at the simple things that are profound. And live into those simple things with a life that is abounding in the work of the Lord. Because everything you do here counts. It's the only chance you get. You ever thought about that? That's the only chance you get to have something count for the Lord. The jewels and wood, hay, and stubble. By the way, that's mostly about teachers, but it still applies to us. All right.